before leaving the nest are furnished usually with more enduring abiding places. In the case of the bald eagle, the young of which do not fly until they are many weeks old, a most substantial structure is provided. It was on the 20th of January, a number of years ago, that the writer was first delighted by the sight of a bald eagle's nest. It was in an enormous pine tree growing in a swamp in central Florida, and being ambitious to examine its contents, I determined to climb to the great eyrie in the topmost crotch of the tree, 131 feet above the earth. By means of climbing irons and a rope that passed around the tree and around my body, I slowly ascended, nailing cleats for support as I advanced. After 2 hours of toil the nest was reached, but another 20 minutes were required to tear aside enough of the structure to permit climbing up one of the limbs on which it rested. In doing this there were brought to view several layers of decayed twigs, pine straw, and fish bones, showing that the birds had been using the nest for many years. Season after season the huge structure had been enlarged by additions until now it was nearly 5 feet in thickness and about 4 feet across the top. At this date it contained 2 fledglings, perhaps 3 weeks old. Having been led to believe that eagles were ferocious birds when their nests were approached, it was with feelings of relief that I noticed the parents flying about at long rifle range. The female, which as is usual with birds of prey was the larger of the pair, once or twice swept within 20 yards of my head, but quickly veered off and resumed her former action of beating back and forth over the tree tops 200 yards away. Nests in holes. The members of the woodpecker family, contrary to certain popular beliefs, do not lay their eggs in hollow trees, but deposit them in cavities that they excavate for that purpose. The bird student will soon learn just where to look for the nest of each species. Thus you may find the nesting cavity of the red-headed woodpecker in a tall stump or dead tree. In some states it is a common bird in towns, and often digs its cavity in a telephone pole. Some years ago a pair excavated a nest and reared their young in a wooden ball on the staff of the dome of the State House in Raleigh, North Carolina. On the plains, where trees are few, the telegraph poles provide convenient nesting sites for woodpeckers of various species. While traveling on a slow train through Texas, I counted 150 telegraph poles in succession, 39 of which contained woodpeckers' holes. Probably I did not see all of them, for not over 2/3 of the surface of each pole was visible from the car window. Not all of these holes, of course, were occupied by woodpeckers in any one season. Flickers, or yellowhammers, use dead trees as a rule, but sometimes make use of a living tree by digging the nest out of the dead wood where a knothole offers a convenient opening. The only place I have ever known them regularly to nest in living trees is in the deserts of Arizona, where the saguaro, or tree cactus, is about the only tree large enough to be employed for such a purpose. In the northern states, flickers sometimes chisel holes through the weatherboarding of ice houses and make cavities for their eggs in the tightly packed sawdust within. They have been known also to lay their eggs in nesting boxes put up for their accommodation. In traveling through the pine barrens of the southern states, one frequently finds grouped about the negroes' cabins and plantation houses the popular chinaberry, or pride of India tree. Here are the places to look for the nest of the hairy woodpecker. In that country, in fact, I have never found a nest of this bird except in the dead slanting limb of a chinaberry tree. The member of this family which displays most originality in its nest building is the red-cockaded woodpecker. It is a southern bird, and the abode for its young is always chiseled from a living pitch pine tree. This in itself is very unusual for any of our eastern woodpeckers. The bird, however, has a still stranger habit. For 2 or 3 feet above the entrance hole, and for 5 or 6 feet below it, all around the tree, innumerable little openings are dug through to the inner bark. From these little wells pour streams of soft resin that completely cover the bark and give the trunk a white, glistening appearance, which is visible sometimes for 1/4 of a mile. Just why they do this has never been explained. It is true, however, that the sticky resin prevents ants and flying squirrels from reaching the nest, and both of these are known to be troublesome to eggs and young birds. A simple plan, which is usually successful in finding out if a woodpecker is at home in its nesting hole, is to strike a few sharp blows on the tree with some convenient club or rock. After a little treatment of this kind, the bird will often come to the entrance and look down, as if to inquire into the meaning of all the disturbance. If the nest has been newly made, many fragments of small chips of wood will be found on the ground beneath the tree. Variety of situations. The student who takes up the subject of nest architecture will soon be impressed not only with the wide assortment of materials used, but also with the wonderful variety of situations chosen. The grebe, or water witch, builds one of the most remarkable nests of any American bird. It is a floating raft, the buoyant part of which is the green stems of water plants, not bent over, but severed from their roots and piled across one another. On this platform is collected decaying vegetation gathered from beneath the water. Here the eggs are deposited and are carefully covered with more decaying vegetation when the bird desires to be absent from the nest. Variation in families. Sometimes there is a wide variety in the character of the nests of different species classified as belonging to the same family. The flycatcher group is a good example of this fact. Here we have as one member of the family the kingbird, that makes a heavy, bulky nest often on one of the outermost limbs of an apple tree. The wood pewee's nest is a frail, shallow excuse for a nest, resting securely on a horizontal limb of some well-grown tree. Then there is the phoebe, that plasters its cup-shaped mass of nesting material with mud, thus securing it to a rafter or other projection beneath a bridge, outbuilding, or porch roof. Still farther away from the typical flycatcher's nest is that made by a perfectly regular member of the family, the great crested flycatcher. The straw and other substances it collects as a bed for its eggs and young is carried into some hollow tree, old woodpecker hole, or nesting box. Often a cast-off skin of a snake is used, and sometimes the end is permitted to hang out of the hole, a sort of scarecrow, perhaps, intended for the notice of annoying neighbors. Meagre nests. Heretofore, mention has been made only of the nests of birds built with much labor and usually constructed in trees and bushes. A very large number of species, however, lay their eggs on the ground with little or no attempt to gather around or beneath them any special nesting material. The killdeer's eggs are simply deposited in a slight hole scratched in the ground, usually in an open field or on a rocky hillside. The only lining is a few grass blades or smooth pebbles. To protect them from enemies, the birds depend much upon the peculiar marking of the eggs, which makes them look like the ground on which they lie, and this seems to be a sufficient safeguard for the eggs and offspring of the species. The nighthawk lays her 2 eggs on the bare ground in a field or open woods, and the whippoorwill's nest is on the fallen leaves of a thicket at any spot which the bird happens to select. The gulls, so common along our coast and about the larger lakes, make substantial nests, as a rule, but not always. I have found them on the islands along the coast of Maine, containing not a dozen blades of grass, a seemingly scant protection against the danger of rolling away to destruction. On the sandy islands of the Atlantic coast, from Long Island southward, many species of terns make nests by simply burrowing a slight depression in the sand among the seashells. Some of the seabirds of the far north, as, for example, the murres and auks, often lay their eggs on the shelving cliffs exposed to the sweep of the ocean gales. These are shaped as if designed by nature to prevent them rolling off the rocks. They are very large at one end, and toward the other taper sharply. When the wind blows, they simply swing around in circles. Although we sometimes speak of the bird's nest as its home, such really is not the case, for the nest of the wild bird is simply the cradle for the young. When the little ones have flown, it is seldom that either they or their parents ever return to its shelter. End of chapter 2.